Welcome to Chronicles of Old Singapore. Mr. Koh has returned to the podcast for another very interesting discussion on the history of education in Singapore. As I mentioned earlier in the previous podcast, he was a teacher, Jalan Lama School in Jurong Road. Mr. Koh then went on to have more than half a century of experience in teaching and in management in MOE at a time when education was undergoing great changes. I've always been interested in education. I was a teacher myself for a short while, and I still teach these days. And education is something that you don't forget and it never really leaves you. I was also a teacher at a time when I didn't know it at the time, but when I graduated from NIE, teaching was just beginning on a new phase. And this is something that Mr. Koh can share with us also, right? And that is the launch of two big initiatives in 1997, National Education and the umbrella policy of the times, Teaching Schools and Learning Nation, with a focus on knowledge-based economy, innovation, critical and creative thinking and all that. But I also think that education is one of the most difficult ministries in Singapore. We have changed so much in many other areas, but changing the mindsets of the stakeholders in education, namely the teachers themselves, the students and the parents, is one of the most difficult challenges in Singapore. So I think with that difficulty, as well as with the big changes that are on the way, next year we're going to have subject-based banding, which is another big change in Singapore. There is something we can learn, I believe, from history, from the experiences of old teachers and educators. And this is where Mr. Koh comes in. So the first question that I have is, Mr. Koh, why did you choose teaching?
Why did I choose teaching? Is that the first question?
That's right.
Yeah. All right. First of all, I came from a very humble home, and probably the first thing I needed was to make sure that we have food on the table. But more than that, it's not just for pay. I felt a calling for teaching because I consider teaching as a vocation rather than a career or a job. My main reason for choosing teaching would have been I felt called to serve in a job or a career that will help people grow in various ways, not just intellectually, but also emotionally, socially, even physically in some ways, because I later became a PE teacher. But most of all, I think it was the attraction or the draw that we as a new nation by then, I entered teaching in 1968, in May 1968, after having served about 4 years in the British Royal Navy. There I felt that what I did was not really commensurate with what I desired, because teaching gives you a touch with human life. You make difference in the life of the person. Essentially, the slogan says, you touch life, making the difference. It's not just mere saying. To me, it was really very factual. At that point, when I was in the Navy, there was no such thing as a proper slogan or selling of teaching as a career or as a vocation. But then I felt, partly also because I experienced a bit of teaching or tutoring in some ways also. I gave tuition for a short while with several people. Let me just share a story about my tutoring experience. That I was just a O-level graduate. I finished 10 years of education. In fact, I did 11 years before I got my school certificate. But there were relatives whose children needed help, and I felt that I should give them the help that they required. without any charges. I did it pro bono, meaning it was free of charge. That service helped me to feel that it was very rewarding, very satisfying to see a person improve in his or her, not in the grade, but in the knowledge that he or she acquired from learning, not only from me, but from the books as well from other experiences. Okay, that was the first instance. Then when I went to church in the 63, 64, after my school cert, I also were called to teach a small group of students. They call it Sunday school every weekend, every week, every Sunday. And there I also experienced that feeling that you're contributing something, not just intellectually, but also in a way inculcating moral teaching in a way, a character formation or personality development in some ways to these children that came and we tell them Bible stories and all that. So those are the two instances of background of experience that I had before I joined teaching. I was in some way also influenced by my church friends. Some of them were teachers, and I found out from them that it was a taxing job, it was a difficult job, but it was also satisfying or rewarding in the long term that you see growth, personality development, and other forms of development in those charges or those students that they handle. So those are the two main reasons, or three reasons. Number one, I had to find a proper vocation or calling or a job or a career to ensure that I brought in substantial amount of money for my family, which I was the sole breadwinner then. My brother just started working when I was going into my job, but in teaching in 1968, by then there were two brothers were having early jobs as well. So I still needed some contribution to my family income. That's one. Number two, more specifically, I felt drawn to teaching because it was a career or in some ways a vocation which help you or you help whoever comes into under your charge, that sense of building them, developing them, helping them to grow in not just in academic but also in their lives, sustaining them if possible through their health or through the cares of caring for them in an emotional, social way, but specifically as a holistic development of the child. So I would say that that feel for people, for students in particular, young people, was the second draw. And lastly, of course, the influence of those that I had been in close contact with. Those are my friends or previous schoolmates or classmates who has entered the career of teaching and who felt that it was a worthwhile uh, effort or worthwhile enterprise to take up. Rather than at that time, Singapore wasn't fully developed, there wasn't full industrialization yet, but yet there were some openings in the market, in the industry. But I felt that this was the one that I wanted to put my whole life into and to devote myself to that service. Yeah, those are the main reason why I entered teaching.
Thanks, Mr. Koh. So Singapore had become independent 3 years earlier.
Yes, yes,
And as you said, industrialization was
yes.
beginning in Jurong,
Yeah, just beginning.
as well as the British were going to pull out.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
So these were actually things that could have an impact on the education sector.
Yes, yes,
Um,
definitely.
What was the role of a teacher in those years?
Okay, let me read to you a little excerpt that the MOE put up at that time. It says, as teachers, you build a foundation of education. Now that's very vague. But number two, equip students with essential skills. That's the one that they emphasize on, essential skills and knowledge to be a productive person. And then, of course, the third point will be that you inculcate some values to prepare them for life. And lastly, they put this interesting point that you should anticipate as a teacher lifelong learning as you grow alongside your student. Even at that point of time, life learning was important. Learning was important.
What year was this statement made?
This statement came out in the 70s.
In the 70s. Okay.
But in the 60s, that will be more the fact that we wanted to bring about a cohesive nation being newly independent. Or during the colonial era, during my time when I was a student, the teacher's role was very limited. The teacher's role was, in fact, restricted mainly to the intellectual development or the academic development. There was a little bit of healthcare or physical part of, there were milk distribution, there were a little bit of telling you the personal hygiene and all that part of it. But after 1959, when I became a student in secondary school, okay, the earlier period when I was in primary school, 1953 to 1958, I felt I could recall then that the teachers were very, to them, it was a 9 to 5 job. In other words, they are very restricted in their role of helping students beyond the classroom. That's one. There were not very much of physical activity or CCA or ECA, what we was called then. So that's one. Number two, by the time I went to secondary school, that was after the colonial period, during Singapore's self-independence period, 59 to 63. That early years of Singapore development, I think there was some form of involvement by teachers for this fact of the fact that we have become self-independent or self-governing, and therefore there was this form of feeling that there were need for intellectual, not for social integration. So Singapore actually, even from the start in 1959, there was an inculcation of values, social values. Then there was the political awakening by our population, the social aspects of living harmoniously in Singapore within that different communities or ethnic group. But in 1963 to 65, I'm sure you realize that we were in Malaysia. That period, the roles of the teacher changed a little bit. I think there was a feeling in school, but then I left school. But from my gathering of people who were teaching then, or people were still in school then, there was this feeling that we owe a greater allegiance to the central government. So teachers' role, they played a part of inculcating this huge national values from Malaysia, all right? But of course, there were contestation in Singapore, being the fact that we brought about the Malaysian slogan, all right? So, okay, so I move on to 1965. So that's independent onwards. When I entered teaching in 68, there was an effect. Let me tell you, there was a huge enlargement of roles and huge increase of responsibility, teachers' responsibility. Okay, number one, the first one that I remember clearly was that we had to socialize, the socialization of our students to become Singaporean. Okay, Singaporean. Whether they are citizen or not, we tell them that they are Singaporean. And that the pledge came in. So the duty of teachers not only involve the classroom, but beyond that. And then the teacher's role concerning the effort to build Singapore as a rugged nation. I think the roles of teachers, the duties of teachers were very, very intense then. I remember clearly that there were often um, people will now call it propaganda, but there were or in indoctrination. But at that time, there was a feeling, there was a fervent feeling by the community, by the teachers, uh, partly from from the ministry, from headquarters source, but also within the community, within the principal, within the teachers, the feeling that we are a nation now, independent, and we have to find our way. So that was that feeling that teachers inculcated, or that values that inculcated in the 1960s. All right, 1965 onwards till 1970. Later, of course, that evolved to other things. But if you recall, Dr. Low, I had experience with many campaigns, and teachers were involved in those campaigns. Let me cite a few of them. Number one, use your hand campaign. So teachers' role include that, all right, inculcation of values, meaning character formation with the students, not just personally, but a holistic thing, being a community, being a nation, being a society that pull together. What about clean toilets? I think that's very pertinent to education, or maybe in society in general. Because I remember distinctly, Dr. Low, when I was in school, the toilets were horrible. But by the 1965, there were improvement, better sewage system and all that. But still, there were not much of good maintenance, not just by the janitors, but also by the fact that students abuse them. They don't really know how to do it. So that was a role of teacher, to teach our students not just the academic or not just the learning aspects in classroom of the textbook, from the textbook, or for exams or whatever, but those values were very clear. Use hand campaign. Teachers had to mobilize students in the class to make sure that they use their hands by cleaning. They come back, I don't know, Saturday morning, even Saturday afternoon, because at that time we still have 6 days of or 6.5 days of schooling. Saturday was there was some lesson being held. Gardening, the greening of Singapore. Those were the things that we remember clearly in campaigns. And what about eating of wheat rather than rice? That role actually was very strange. How do you tell your student that in homes it's better to eat more wheats? So you demonstrate yourself. You bring bread, or probably invite them to canteen and say the noodles are made from wheats and all that. So there's several things in as far as the independent aspect is concerned. But more specifically, I think not just in this socialization of as a nation, in that building of communities, building of societies, but also the economic aspect, the industrialization part, which I mentioned earlier and which you referred to as well. We were told specifically that students need to learn skills that are relevant, pertinent to our workforce. All right. In other words, to help them to become workers in the factory, or mechanics, or refrigerators, repairers, shoemakers, various simple skills that we were told to do it, and that's where the start of the workshop practices in the late 60s, in the late 60s, not in the early 60s, because they had to build a workshop ready. So many aspects of it involve the fact that we have become a nation. So teachers' role were enlarged, teachers' duties or responsibility were increased dramatically. And I think, to me, I would say that actually it helps in terms of what I would describe as the role of teachers. personally as that of the 4 or 5 domains that I earlier adhered to. The fact that we uh, people of intellectual or mental domain, the fact that we want to increase their knowledge and skill, that's true. But also in the fact that in the social domain, in the social emotional domain that our students are, and so that part I think will increase, and also psychologically much later, social emotional was one of them, and the physical part. Okay, so a more holistic uh, duties of teachers were involved. Although there was specialization, I must say, there were some just purely classroom teachers. Some of us were more involved with ECA and that development in terms of beyond classroom, which were part of our roles as well. So I see that as some of the things happening after independence. Okay, is that does it
Yeah,
sound right to you?
that's
Yeah.
great. That's great. Teachers
Yes.
had so many tasks to do, right, in
Yeah.
the late 60s. What was
Yeah.
the pay? What was your first pay?
Oh, okay. You're asking about whether they commensurate with the duties that we had at that time. Not, no, I don't think at that time the pay was huge. All right, but comparatively or relatively to someone who works in the office, a clerk or somebody like that, I think after training, our pay was slightly more. Let me give you an illustration. I think this is a true life illustration. My parents were concerned about that aspect because by the 4th year in my work as I was then a senior clerk or clerical staff in the Royal Navy in the service at that point, it was surprisingly there was over $300. Surprisingly, because we started on a higher scale. Perhaps they used the British model or whatever. Um, we started from 250 to 300 plus. Within a year, we had about $100 or more, 150 increment, all right, per year. But when I joined teaching, I had to suffer a drop in my salary. Instead of 320, which I was receiving, I only got in my training years, all right, 290. So it was about $30 less. And therefore, my parents said, well, what's the point? You earn more there. But of course, I think you mentioned something about the withdrawal. I said, look, Pa, if I stay on, I may not get a job. So they said, okay, give it a try. But of course, the base was converted to become private shipyards. All right, I could have stayed on and move along that line, but I have no regret whatsoever because the pay was very small increase per year. There was a slight jump because from 21295, let me be clear, when I started, it moved to 315, $20 because I cleared the first year exam. We had 2 exams, all right, professional exam they call it. During the time there was no NIE, it was the Singapore Teachers Training College, sometimes referred to as the Teachers Torture Chambers. Okay, that I'll explain later. But whatever it is, I went through the first year successfully, passed the exam, and we had 315. Even then, it was still did not match what my last drawn at the British Navy or British base at that time. Okay, but then when I passed the final professional exam, the second one, it moved to 385, I think, for 395. So there was a huge jump when you became a qualified teacher. So in that sense, I think it was. I think my parents were consoled by that fact, whatever it is. But I don't think I went in teaching just for that to be earning more than other places. So, but industrialization came about, and it started to be in full bloom by the 70s. By then, I was qualified, and there were jobs out there which can match or which could match what I got about 385 or 395 or whatever. Okay, and there were jobs that were critical, but well earned. I mean, there were banking jobs or other services job that could pay 400 plus. Okay, so whatever it was not a bad deal, but I think in view of the fact that the increased workload, the increased roles that we had to play, the more responsibility, and also there's one thing that I didn't mention: many non-teaching duties. At that point of time, by the late 60s and early 70s, there was this obsession. Oh, I'm not sure is the right word, but there was this the large or this effort to gather data, and there were a lot of surveys done by the government, and the teachers were the front end to do surveys, mainly in classroom, but there was sometimes that we need to do in the community as well. So that's a strange thing. More non-teaching duties, dealing with parents started to come in, dealing with the communities, the RCs or whatever, they need help, whatever. So we took some of those things on. So in other words, the role of the teacher were not strictly within school by then. All right. It was mainly in school, but there were other outside non-specific non-teaching duties as well. So I would say that, but they were very educational. They were very useful to those of us who were young teachers. There were a lot of grumbling by the older teachers, because when they came in teaching in the 50s or early 60s, there were no such demand on them. So for us, I wouldn't say we sailed through it, but we took it in our stride. Okay, so that very year when I joined and when I qualified to the 70s, I enjoyed doing the duties that were put on me, both in school as well as externally. There were more things like youth festival. There were more inter-school competition. There were things that we did beyond our teaching role. All right, just those things that were very useful to me, at least, that there were growth in me as I encounter them, as I embrace them, as I were involved in them. Okay, but
were you a PE teacher or were you also an English teacher?
Okay, I was both. I was a PE teacher trained in one subject called PE. The other subject was English in the Teachers Training College. We specialized in two disciplines or two subjects. And our training was just 2 short years, part-time. And it was really taxing. It was grueling. It was really demanding on you. Because if you remember, national service was on the card, but I was not eligible or I was not required to do it. But because I was beyond the age group that they took 18 to 20 or whatever it is, but because I entered the Teachers Training College in 1968, I was then 24 years old. And I was caught to do national service part-time because they said, you have entered an institution of higher learning. I actually asked the person recruiting, I said, what do you mean by institution of higher learning? Does it mean only university? No. Even your institution, the Teachers Training College. And what do we get after the 2 years? Not a diploma, by the way. We got only a certificate in education, stroke HSC. By then I have my higher school certificate. All right, so we are 2 years. For those who had O level, they started on much lower scale, 195. Imagine that, 195. I had 295 starting, but they had to do 3 years part time and 3 years of national service, same length of time. Let me explain that the role of teachers were useful to me is that I was taxed to the full during the 2 years. When I graduated in 1970. In other words, when I finished my certificate in education, not diploma, certificate in 1970, I were able to sustain the new pressure because of the 2 years that I went through. Okay, let me explain to you why the 2 years were very hectic. In the morning, I would teach, because in this school, Jalan Lama, Jalan Lama, we had only morning stream or morning session. There were not enough students for the afternoon session. Okay, in the morning, I will be there from 7 to 1 o'clock. I rush to the teachers training college to be in time for the college 3 times a week from 2 to 5 p.m. Okay, then after 5, I rushed to a training center for my national service. I was in the police national service. I was put in there as part-time because I had to fulfill my contract as a teacher. So I was not put in full-time. But also I was put in the police national service because I've done voluntary special constabulary duties before. I was there about 3 years after my O-level. I did service during the confrontation period in 63, 64, 65. All right. So anyway, it was very grueling, very hectic. Besides preparing for the lesson the following day, whether it's PE lesson or English lesson, you still have to prepare it. A PE was easier to prepare, of course. But marking was also the other thing. So the role of the teachers demand you to do beyond the classroom, beyond your own marking, preparation, teaching, delivery of lessons and all those things. Okay, so that prepared me for the 70s when a lot of pressure came in, even in the early 70s. As I mentioned, the campaigns, the non-teaching duties, and a lot of involvement in the community as well. Partly because there were some teachers who were mainly let off because they were older, partly, but partly they resisted this more expensive role or more duties and responsibility. Okay, could I jump to the 1979?
Not yet, not yet. I want to
Yeah.
stay. I want to stay in the 70s.
Yeah.
I want to stay in the 70s.
Oh, you want to stay in the 70s? Yeah, go on.
Yeah. What was the methodology of teaching in the 70s?
That was the old-fashioned way. If you recall rightly, when I was in primary school, before I started primary, I went to a Chinese school, which was a primary Chinese school, to go in their first year because they allow before reaching the age of 7. I was 6 plus or 5 plus. They allowed that. But I remember very clearly it was mere rote learning. The methodology was memorization. The teacher just took the textbook and read from the textbook, or just say, okay, you do your reading or whatever it is. So when I started in Jalan Lama, it was similar because it was more of a Chinese school. But I decided to break out of that because I think students were very bored. Okay, because I was bored. Even in primary school, in the English stream, there was some of this methodology or pedagogy, we call it, where teacher-centered teaching. All right, there was never the student-centered teaching during those era, up to the 70s. Probably by the 80s, there were some changes when Dr. Goh came in and the curriculum changed. Okay, so if you ask me, it was really old-fashioned. It was teacher-centered. The teacher sometimes faces the chalkboard. There was no whiteboard then. The chalkboard, and talk to the chalkboard. And we have to strain and make sure we try to understand that. That was as a student. But when I observed as I passed through classes in Jalan Lama, the teachers were doing exactly the same methodology or pedagogy, the type of teaching that was prevalent even in the 70s. 68, 70, 71, I left Jalan Lama. Then I went to Swiss Scottish Secondary there was a slight difference because I think there were Malay and English stream. In Jalan Lama, it was supposed to be English and Chinese stream, but there wasn't many English stream classes. There were only one per level. It started in 69. All right, I was there in 68. There was completely a Chinese school. Okay, in Swiss Cottage, there was slight change because I think there were more English stream. That's one. And the principal, the head teacher or the headmaster play a role in that. It wasn't anything from the ministry that prevailed. It was the school leader that prevailed to say, look, you cannot be teaching that way. Why don't we try some workshop and all that? And in Swiss Cottage, we had teachers' workshop where there was this feeling that we could learn from one another how to manage the class. That's one. How to impart knowledge. Two, how to ensure that there were experiential learning. There were children or group work. There was three. Okay. How to go beyond the classroom. That's four. So the methodology changed over time, but also different schools had a different methodology. So my teaching sort of improved more when I went to Swiss Cottage Secondary, which I was there for almost 10 years, from 71 to 1980. And I think partly the effort came from the more senior teachers, from the principal, and as a community of teachers, we also were more open to being mentored, or we were more open to learning, and they were more open to sharing. Okay, so that's a big difference in terms of school. I won't say that applies to all secondary school or all English secondary school, but I would say that the aided school, the mission school, especially the mission English school, all right, were generally further ahead in terms of teaching methodology or pedagogy in the classroom. Okay, so is that clear as far as I'm concerned? The government school were less of that because there wasn't this tradition that there was sharing of teachers' work or sharing to help a young teacher to come in. In fact, I was very glad because at Jalan Lama, I was struggling all by myself, except for one former classmate of mine from Bukit Panjang who was with me. So I learned from him. But there wasn't really no sharing of how you should do things in classroom. Whether it was teaching or not teaching stuff, you were left all your own. Okay, but I learned in a hard way. But when I went to Swiss Cottage, there was definitely much more in terms of my learning to be a better teacher, in terms of teaching pedagogy, or as you mentioned, methodology, in terms of interacting with students, in terms of classroom management, in terms of acting beyond the classroom, bringing them out, excursions and all that. Although at Jalan Lama, we did it on our own accord to bring students out for excursion or for year-end, whatever, picnic or whatever. So those were things that are essentially educational, essentially building their confidence, eventually being able to interact with others, learning from others, and in a very non-formal setting. So in Swiss Cottage, we had that. Okay.
Yeah. Could you say something about the excursions or other activities that you organize for the students at Swiss Cottage?
Yes, I would do that. Camps were one of the early things. Camps because in camps, it was more than just one day activity, which we did for excursion, picnic, hikes, or whatever. Okay. Camps actually bring about a different socio-economic, social psychological impact. Now, I'm a avid, or I'm a fervent believer in camps, partly because in the teachers training college, we PE teachers were very fortunate because we had several camps and we were told to become more independent, self-reliant, and have initiative. And that put us in a very good state when we became teachers. And we became camp instructors. And that was a great role we played at the Teachers Training College, because we were instructing our peers. All right, we were a very prestigious group in that, about a handful, about 10 to 15 instructors. Every year, there were end of the year, or not only end of year, but in the mid-year, we have camps at Pulau Tukong. We had actual, real, challenging, outdoor, not just fun, but learning camps, all right, where the curriculum would include things like campcraft, map reading, outdoor activities, canoeing, sailing even, and other challenges that were in the outdoor. All right. So when I went to Swiss Cottage with a handful of other PE teachers and other like-minded teachers who are not PE teachers, we built into the curriculum and the non-formal curriculum with the blessing of the principal, who was then an Olympian, Mr. Rudy Morspergen. He was hockey top star in the 1956 Olympia. But he believed in this and he supported us. He provided the financial resources and other resources which we could do camps at Pulau Ubin. Because by then, in the 70s, Pulau Tukong, which is a much larger campsite, much larger area for exploration, were being closed because the National Service were taking over, the SAF were taking over Pulau Tukong by the late 70s or by mid-70s. Okay, by the early 70s, we did go to camp at Pulau Tukong for a few times, but later more in Pulau Ubin. Okay, camps were the critical aspects of our non-classroom activity, because in camps, the students are exposed to beyond just the daily thing, the night thing as well, the night sleep, the interaction with students, how they cook, how they prepare themselves, how they work as a team, how they collaborated, how they able to bring about a sense of confidence in very uphill challenges we put in their place. So we had this, it was not a fun camp. It was never a pleasure camp. Yeah, you can go to your fun camp, your picnic fun camp on your own. But we decided that a 4-day camp or 5-day camp, the maximum we had was 1 week, 7 days.
Yeah, it was not a
holiday.
fun camp. Did the students enjoy it?
Oh, no, definitely they do.
No.
Yeah, they may suffer a bit in the initial stage. You know, kids being kids at that age, in the range from 13 to 14 to 15, or even some 16, they like challenges, and they like to work as a group if you give them the, or you provide them the environment for that. In the classroom, you can do that, team building, cooperative learning, whatever it is. But those things were limited in just to learn about certain facts, learn about certain skills. But outdoor, or much more than just learning skills, more than learning knowledge of how to build a fire or that, but of how to interact with each other, how you work with each other so that you can achieve the fullest maximum from the team effort. Okay, so they do. I would say that we had feedbacks. Okay, maybe not official feedback team, but we have a short list where they write their reflection. And usually the reflection is written in the evening for half an hour. And usually the first 2-3 days, there were complaints, they were grumbling. But by the third day, there was definite sign of change. By the fourth and fifth day, normally sometimes the last day, they don't want to go home. Or by the fifth day, they say, can we extend or whatever? So I can attest to that. I can testify to that. Camps, if we don't make it like another classroom work, if we don't make it too rigid, like you have to follow too many rules. So in other words, we allow initiative, we allow their own self-exploration with the group, we allow lots of open-ended activities. But of course, the safety concern, that's a role of the teacher, I think. The safety concern the safety environment have to be very carefully monitored, because sometimes if they do road work, they do abseiling or whatever it is, if they don't follow the right procedure, they can get hurt. And there were accidents. Okay, I mean, we had, for example, hornet sting, where, for example, people fell into the deep end of the river, or canoe capsized and they didn't have proper life jacket. So all those things were taken into consideration. What we call risk management, which we were taught at TDC. Okay, I would say that definitely camps were one essential part. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I ask you if camps or other activities like that can be applied to the academic subjects?
Oh, sure. That will be the camps that I organized were not such that it was like a maths camp or a science camp or even English camp. All right, that could be organized, and I did one English camp within the school compound. It was not a difficult part, but you have to have more preparation for their worksheet. All right, the maths camp or the science camp or even English camp. You have to make sure that they were brainstorming among the teachers, all right, to come up with proper worksheet, and there were proper feedback, there were proper monitoring of how they do it, and ensuring that they benefit to the fullest of your objectives, all right, of your aims in that camp. Now, I agree with you that you can learn those skills, both knowledge as well as skill, mainly skills for science, math, or English in such camp as academic, or you call it subject camp. All right, that was done, but I wasn't involved too much with it because the academic teachers, the head of department, we didn't have head of department then, but we call them senior subject teachers, were actually brought to some of our camps. The outdoor camps were more for value inculcation, socialization, building of confidence and all that. And they actually did some of that. I didn't have a chance to find out how successful they were, but they continued with it. And that was improved upon in my next experience as a teacher when I became a senior teacher in RJC, as well as became vice principal in the college. I think those things were critical, but they need not be long camps. They could learn things even at night, overtime, night duties, or what are things that they do for their maths, calculation of the stars, and for the science, or whatever it is. So, yeah, I agree with you. Camps are not applicable only for inculcation of values or character or personality development or confidence building, but also for academic arena as well. Yeah, so that is a very unfortunately not much use tools. We call these tools actually. The experience in camp counts, but the tools you use in the camp is also very critical. I mean, the objective for that camp is critical. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great idea. I just want to ask you, how were students like in the 70s?
Okay, yeah. Let me make a quick comparison, can I?
Yes,
Between
yes.
my experience earlier in Jalan Lama
Yes.
and also my experience as a student myself. Okay.
Go ahead.
First of all, a student myself in a primary school, I was completely ignorant. I was completely, you would say, like a frog in a well. Okay, the students among my peers, they were the same. We were really at that time, maybe the era, and also the fact that we came from lower socioeconomic families or background. We were totally ignorant of the fact there was a big world outside there. Even in Singapore, we did not travel much. We had no television. We had radio, a few of us had at home, and we hardly need newspaper. Okay, so the students were very innocent, I would say, in the primary school. Even when I went to secondary school, partly because I went to a rural secondary school, Bukit Panjang. Even then, the students were fairly innocent. I would say that among my peers, very few would have traveled overseas. Very few would have experience of having libraries at home or books at home. Okay, a few could have television, perhaps. I didn't have television even in secondary school. But when I started teaching, by the 68, there were many of this thing available. There were books, newspaper available. But the school that I taught in, the one in Jalan Lama in Jurong, were definitely very deprived students, okay? Which I described the previous lesson. They were the salt of the earth. They were still innocent, but what they saw was within the community, within their farms. Perhaps some of them would have traveled to Jurong Kicil, 7 Milestone, a bit further down to maybe Newton area. And the most, they would have been the fringe of the city, Chinatown maybe, but not in the directly in central of in Raffles Place or City Hall or whatever it is. Okay, so they came from that socio-economic background. And because I would assume that other government schools, if they will come from similar working class background, then students will be such that they needed more sort of help from the teachers. So the role of the teacher actually differs from that of a town school or well-established school like ACS, St. Margaret's or CHIJ or MGS, those top schools like RI, the Chinese High, or whatever it is. That would be different from what I experienced as a teacher in Jalan Lama, as well as in Swiss Cottage. Now, in Swiss Cottage, although it was a government school, we are enlightened principal, we are enlightened workforce, meaning the teachers, we still found more difficult teaching because their horizon were limited. Many of my students came from the area where Singapore Turf Club is now, or was then, the 6 Mile Singapore Turf Club, the original. Their parents were, especially the Malay parents, were workers, were laborers. Some of them were assistant to jockeys. There were grass cutters and whatever. So poor economic background, their home, you would expect that they don't read much newspaper, they don't have much books. So that's the point. The Chinese student, very strangely, came from the upper part of Bukit Timah, the upper part of Lim Chu Kang, the upper part of Jurong. So the better ones came to Swiss Cottage. So again, they would have been, but they were brighter kids. They were brighter kids than those that came to Jalan Lama. They were brighter in the sense that they did better in their PSLE. In Swiss Cottage were not the top ranked school, not the top school compared to Victoria, RI, or BT, or Bartley, or whatever it is. But they were not too bad. But they were the better ones that were hardworking, and they were influenced to those that came from even poorer background. They could have come from the farms, or their parents could be starting to work in some of the industrial sites or whatever. But they were brighter, they had broader outlook, and their horizon was slightly higher than those who were students who came from working class background or even lower background than that. Okay, so that would be my assessment of students in the 70s. So if you look at the 70s, the better schools would already have better students just as during the colonial era or just as pre-70s. In the 60s, when Singapore was self-independent and then independent and all that. So it depends on where you were. So it is not a generalization, but by and large, I would say most government schools would be in the similar socio-economic background as those that I experienced in Swiss Cottage, not at Jalan Lama in the 70s. because I taught in Jalan Lama until 71. So I went to Swiss Cottage in end of 71, and I experienced slightly different or better, I would say, better income groups students, students that come from better income groups. Okay,
Mr. Koh.
yeah.
Yeah. In the 70s, were students easier or more difficult to teach?
I would think that slightly easier than later stage when I was still teaching or I was leading schools by the 80s and the 90s. Okay, so the 70s wasn't bad. Okay, 70s, the pressure started coming on in terms of teacher's role. If you're talking about teacher's role, because by the 70s, there were more monitoring by the MOE. Of course, the most drastic monitoring came when Dr. Goh did the Go reform or Go report in 1979. That was still in the 70s, right? But the effect was in the 80s that the teacher really suffered, 80s and 90s, okay, suffered more. In the 70s, I would say that we still enjoyed quite a bit. That the students were still fairly not so sophisticated and not so badly influenced by the media. Okay, I'm sorry to use that word. The bad influence by the media, which we experience now, the social media as well as the mainstream media. They were still parochial, if I use the word. Parochial meaning there was still not, there was no globalization yet. There wasn't this influx of information from all over the world. So in the 70s, I would say our students were generally still fairly innocent. Drug was becoming a problem, drug addiction, all right, because of the influence of society, I think. Okay, drug was a bit of that, or what they call sniffing or glue sniffing. All right, there was a bit of that because they wanted to experience those things. Okay, but they were easier to teach because the parent support was still there by the 70s. It was towards the 80s when there were more educated parents that I think we had experience of more difficult teaching because the parents pampered them by the 80s. In the 70s, none of my students, very few, were recalcitrants, were pampered students. The family size was still about 4, 5, or maybe 3. But by the 80s, the effect of the two-child family was really drastic by the 80s. And when you have small families, that is the social impact on the student's life. When they come to school, whether it's primary or secondary, they come from pampered families in that sense. Generally, I wouldn't say all, but generally. So therefore, I would say my students, when I was teaching in the 70s, were still, I will, in inverted commas, angels. They were still angels. But when I came back from my university after 3 years, 1980 to 83, then I saw there was a difference. I had 3 years of undergraduate study. I was a mature student and was given a grant to do a 3 years university course. And I did that really, I mean, I wouldn't say exceptionally well. I did very well, but I came back to teach and I found complete difference, partly also because it went to a different type of school. I went to teach in a junior college, all right? But in a pre-U, I taught even pre-U in the Swiss Cottage. I didn't find that difficult students, and I think their lives were simpler by then, perhaps even in the 70s. Their parents were not as well educated as the teachers, and their families relatively wasn't that small, wasn't just one or two in the family. Okay, so there were at least 3, 4, or sometimes 5 children still when they were in secondary school, when they were in pre-U. Okay, so that's my take, because my experience certainly helped me to look back when I became a principal, that there are bound to be social changes, there are bound to be impact, because the home also changed, the country has changed, and the impact of verbalization came in the 80s or by the late 80s and 90s as well. Okay,